I sat in a courtroom in Marshall County and watched my own attorney set two pieces of paper on the table, one at a time, slow, the way you set a level before you trust a beam to it. Kevin Mullins read the second page over my daughter's shoulder, and I watched the color leave his face before the judge even looked up. I did not say a word. I had already said everything I needed to say, 2 years earlier, in an office he did not know existed. But that is the end of it, and I am not going to hand you the end before you have earned it. Let me take you back to a gravel lot behind a shop, with my name on the sign, decades before any of this. My name is Harold Adams. I am 71 years old. I built Adams Mechanical out of one used van and a case of tools, back when a man's word and a firm handshake still closed a job. For a long time, it was the only thing in this county with my name on it that people trusted more than the bank. Before I go on, tell me something. What city are you watching this from tonight? My wife is gone now. The coffee pot she used every morning still sits on my stove, dented on one side, where she used to set it down too hard when she was laughing at something I said. I have never once thought to throw it out. She used to tell me I built things sturdier than I talked, and she was not wrong. I was never a man who said much. I was a man who checked the load before he signed off on it, every time, no exceptions, and that habit did not retire when I did. Our daughter Katie was raised watching that. She used to sit on an overturned bucket in the shop bay and hand me wrenches by size before she could tie her own shoes. Her mother, Rhonda, and I did not stay married. That is an old story, and a plain one. No villains in it, just two people who wanted different things by the time Katie was in grade school. Rhonda remarried a few years after, to a man named Kevin Mullins, who ran his own outfit, excavation and concrete work, and who Katie in time called her Stepfather, without any bitterness in it. I never held that against either of them. A child needs steady hands around her, and for a long while, I believed Kevin's were steady enough. I want to tell you about something I did in the spring of 2024 because it matters more than anything else in this story, and I did it quietly, and I did it for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone betraying me. I sat down with my attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Craig Dunn, and I restated my living trust. I was 69 that year, in good health, still driving out to job sites twice a week to look over bids. But I had buried enough friends by then to know how fast a strong man can turn into a line item on somebody else's spreadsheet. I asked Craig to write in two things most people never think to ask for. One was a clause that required any physician question about my competence to be answered by two independent doctors, not one and not anyone handpicked by a family member in a hurry. The other was a forfeiture clause, plain and simple, that stripped any beneficiary who tried to challenge my capacity through the courts, if that challenge failed. I did not write that clause because I suspected Kevin specifically. I wrote it because I had watched money trouble do strange things to otherwise decent men, and Kevin's excavation business had been running lean for longer than he liked to admit at family dinners. Call it a roof I put up before I ever smelled rain. I also started seeing a doctor named Ayala every year after that, on my own schedule, not because anyone made me. Once a year, she'd run me through the same tests, memory, reasoning, the whole battery, and file the results away clean and dated. I did that for the same reason a contractor keeps his own inspection log, even when the county already signed off. If anyone ever came looking to prove I couldn't run my own affairs, I wanted a paper trail longer than theirs, and I wanted it to already exist before they thought to ask. None of that felt dramatic at the time. It felt like maintenance. A man keeps his truck serviced whether or not he plans on a long trip. Now, let me bring you to this June, to a wedding at a place called Cedar Valley Barn. Wood beams and string lights and gravel crunching under everybody's good shoes. Katie was marrying a young man named Justin, and I could not have been prouder walking in that morning. I had my suit pressed. I had a small blue ribbon in my jacket pocket that used to belong to my wife, just to carry a piece of her in there with me. I found Katie in a side room off the barn, in her dress, and she looked so much like her mother did at that age that it caught me somewhere under the ribs. She turned when I came in, and there was a wedding coordinator standing behind her with a clipboard, and Kevin was already in the doorway in a gray suit that fit him a little too well for a man who told me business was slow. Katie said, "Dad, I need to tell you something before we start." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Kevin's going to walk me down the aisle. It just felt right. He's been there for so much of it, and I didn't want you to hear it from the program." I stood there for a second. I want to be honest with you. That second stretched out longer than it had any right to. I looked at Kevin, and Kevin looked at the floor, which told me he already knew this was not his idea to argue for out loud. I said, "All right, that was it." That was all I gave her. Not because I didn't feel it, I felt it the way you feel a truck pull loose from a jack, sudden and low in the gut. But because I have never once believed shouting fixed a single thing in my whole life. I told her I loved her. I told her the day was hers to spend, however she saw fit. Then I walked back out through the barn, past the folding chairs and the mason jars full of wildflowers, past people who did not yet know what had just happened in that side room, and I got in my truck. I did not go find a seat. I did not stand in the back and watch another man do the one thing I had been saving for her since she was small enough to ride on my shoulders. I turned the key and I drove home. And I want you to understand that was not anger driving. I have done angry, and it is loud, and it does not last. This was something quieter and a great deal more permanent settling into place, the way concrete sets once you've stopped watching it. I got home before the vows were even said. I sat in my kitchen with my wife's coffee pot on the stove, and I did not turn on a single light. I did not call Katie. I did not call Kevin. I took the little blue ribbon out of my jacket pocket and set it on the table. And I thought about a gravel lot decades gone, and a girl on an overturned bucket handing me wrenches by size, and I thought, quietly, that something in this family had shifted, and I intended to find out exactly how far. What I did not know yet, sitting in the dark kitchen, was that the shift had a shape to it already, one with a return address and a pattern to the mail, and that I was about to start noticing things I had spent 2 years quietly preparing for without ever wanting to be right. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after that wedding, because nothing about it was loud, and that is exactly why you need to hear it slow. Katie called me the next morning. I let it ring twice before I picked up, not out of spite, just because my hand was in a coffee cup and habits don't break for hurt feelings. She said she was sorry if the day had been hard on me. She said Kevin had been there for a lot of the planning, the deposits, the caterer, the arguing with the barn owner over the parking situation, and it had felt natural in the moment to ask him. She did not once say she was sorry for what she had actually done. She said sorry it was hard, which is a different animal altogether from sorry I did it, and I have been in business long enough to know the difference between an apology and a weather report. I told her I loved her and that I was glad the day went well otherwise. I meant every word of it. Then I got off the phone and went out to the shop because standing still with a thing like that in my chest has never once done me any favors. I have found, over 71 years, that the body wants to work through what the mind is still deciding how to feel. It was maybe 10 days later that I noticed the first pamphlet. It came folded into the regular mail, wedged between the electric bill and a flyer for a hardware store sale. Easy to miss if you weren't the kind of man who opens every piece of paper that comes to his mailbox, which I am. Bright cover, soft colors, a photograph of a silver-haired couple laughing over a card game at a table that looked like nobody had ever spilled coffee on it in its life. Across the top, it said something about transitioning your loved one with dignity. Underneath that, smaller, a name of a facility 2 counties over, and underneath that, smaller still, a line about guardianship consultation services available on site. Now, I want to be plain with you. A man my age gets mail like that sometimes. It is not, by itself, strange. Companies buy lists. They mail everybody over a certain age who owns a home outright, because that is where the money is, and they are not shy about who they are trying to reach. I set it on the counter and did not think much of it. Then another one came the following week. Different company, same general shape. This one about power of attorney and what it called peace of mind, planning for your family's future. And a week after that, one addressed not to me, but to Kevin Mullins, care of my address, which meant somebody had either made a clerical mistake or somebody had used my address on a form somewhere without asking me first. That third one is the one that stopped me at the counter. I stood there a long minute with that envelope in my hand, turning it over, looking at the little window where my own address showed through the paper, plain as day, next to Kevin's name. I have poured enough concrete in my life to know the difference between a crack that happens on its own and a crack somebody put there on purpose with a chisel. This had chisel marks on it. I did not call anybody that day. I want you to understand that about me, because I know some of you watching would have been on the phone inside of 5 minutes, and maybe that is the right instinct for some men. It was never mine. My instinct, the one that built a business out of a used van, has always been to look twice before I ever say a word, because the man who talks first in a dispute is usually the man who ends up explaining himself later. So, I got a plain manila folder out of the drawer in my desk where I used to keep bid sheets, and I wrote a date on the tab in pencil, and I put that envelope inside it. The wellness call came about 2 weeks after that. Rhonda phoned me on a Tuesday evening, and I want to say plainly, we have always been able to talk civil, Rhonda and I, all these years since the divorce. And that evening started out no different. She asked how I'd been. She asked if I was eating right, living alone the way I do. I said I was fine, same as I always say because I generally am. Then she said Kevin had been worried about me since the wedding, said I'd seemed a little foggy that day, a little slow to answer when Katie told me about the aisle. I sat with that a second. Foggy is not the word for a man who drove himself home clear-headed enough to obey every speed limit and every stop sign the whole way. And I told her so, gentle as I could manage. I said I heard what my daughter told me, and I made a decision about how to spend the rest of that day, and that decision was mine to make, clear as a bell. She said, "Of course, Harold, nobody's saying otherwise. We just love you and want to make sure you're taking care of yourself." Now, here's the thing about a phrase like that. Said once from somebody who means it, it is a kindness. Said as an opener before somebody asks whether you've had any trouble remembering names lately, or whether you still feel comfortable balancing your own checkbook, or whether you've thought about having somebody come by and help you with your bills, it is not a kindness anymore. It is a survey. And she asked me all three of those things inside of 10 minutes. Soft-voiced, easy, like she was just making conversation, and I answered every one of them plain and complete. Because I did not yet have anything to hide, and I was not about to start acting like I did. But I noticed. I have spent my whole working life noticing things other men walk right past. A hairline crack in a foundation nobody else would catch until the whole wall was leaning. The particular sound an engine makes 2 weeks before it throws a rod. I noticed that Rhonda's questions had a shape to them, the same shape as the pamphlets in my folder. And I noticed that Kevin had not called me himself, not once. Not to ask how I was, not to say a word about the wedding, which for a man who just spent the better part of a year in my daughter's life-planning table settings, struck me as its own kind of tell. A week after that call, Kevin showed up at the shop. I was under the hood of my own truck at the time. Nothing complicated. Just changing the oil myself the way I've always done. Because a man who lets other people do every small job for him forgets how his own machine runs. I heard his truck in the gravel, and I straightened up and wiped my hands on a rag, and there he was, in a work shirt this time, instead of that gray suit, trying to look like a man just passing through. He said he was in the area for a job, and thought he'd stop and see how I was doing. I said I was doing fine, same as ever, and asked him how business was. He said business was steady, which is the kind of answer a man gives when business is not steady at all. And I would know because I built a company from nothing, and I know exactly what a man's face does when he's saying words that aren't true and hoping you're too polite to notice. He asked me if I still drove myself everywhere. I said I did. He asked if I'd had any trouble lately, remembering appointments, that kind of thing. I said no. He asked, almost like it was an afterthought, if I still handled all my own finances, or if I'd thought about maybe having some help with that, just to make things easier on myself. I looked at him a long moment. I have negotiated enough contracts across enough gravel lots to know when a man is laying groundwork for something, he has not yet worked up the nerve to ask for outright. And that is exactly what Kevin was doing, standing in my shop, asking me questions like he was filling out a form in his head as I answered them. I told him I handled my own finances just fine, same as I have for 50 years. And that if he ever had a real concern, he was welcome to say it to my face instead of walking around it. He laughed it off, said he didn't mean anything by it, said he just worried about me being out here alone. Then he left, and I stood in that gravel lot a good while after his truck pulled out. And I thought about pamphlets, and I thought about a phone call full of soft questions. And I thought about a man asking about my finances in a shop he had not set foot in for over a year. I went inside and I added that visit to the folder. Date, time, what he said, as close to word for word as I could recall it. I have written enough estimates in my life to trust my memory for exact language, and I trusted it that evening too. Then I picked up the phone and called Dr. Ayala's office. The girl who answered knew my voice before I gave my name, which happens when you've been a patient someplace long enough. I told her I wanted to come in and do my yearly evaluation, the full one, same as always. She checked the calendar and said Dr. Ayala had an opening in a few days and asked if that worked. I said it did. I did not tell her why I wanted it moved up. I did not need to. I had started that habit 2 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with any one person, a roof built before I ever smelled rain. And now the rain had a name and a truck and a way of asking questions with his eyes somewhere else in the room. I was not going to wait for somebody to decide for me whether my mind still belonged to me. I was going to walk into that office on my own 2 feet, same as every year, and let the record speak for itself before anybody else ever got the chance to write their own version of it. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen a minute, my wife's coffee pot dented and quiet on the stove, and I felt something in my chest settle the way it does when you've finally found the crack you've been listening for, and you know, at last, exactly where to start digging. I drove out to Dr. Ayala's office 2 mornings later, and I want to tell you plain, I have never once in my life dressed up for a doctor's appointment, but that morning I put on a collared shirt anyway, not for her, for the file. I have learned that a record looks a certain way when a man takes it seriously, and I intended for mine to look exactly that way from the first page. Her office sits above a pharmacy on the square, 2nd floor, the kind of building where the stairs creak in a way that tells you it's been standing longer than most of the people who climb them. Dr. Ayala has been my doctor 11 years now, ever since my regular man retired and handed his whole practice over to her, files and all. She's sharp. She does not waste a sentence, and she does not let a patient waste one either, which is exactly why I trust her. She came into the room with my chart already open on her tablet and looked at the date before she looked at me. She said, "Harold, you were just in here for your annual back in the spring." I said, "I know it." She said, "Is something wrong?" I told her no, nothing was wrong, that I just wanted the full workup again, the whole battery, memory, reasoning. The works, same as I've done every year since I started. And I wanted it dated and signed and put in the file, same as always. She studied me a second the way she does, like she's reading a gauge, and she said, "All right." She didn't push. That's one of the things I've always liked about her. She asked the questions she needed to ask, and let the rest of it be my business. We went through it the way we always do. She asked me to remember 3 words and tell them back to her later. She asked me to draw a clock face and put the hands at a certain time. She asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s, which I have done every year for 2 years now, and which still makes me feel like I'm back in the 8th grade being called on by a teacher I hadn't studied for. She asked me who was president, what the date was, where we were sitting. She asked me to name as many animals as I could in a minute, and I got through a fair list before she called. Time, deer, and hog, and heron, and a few more besides. Ordinary questions. Not one of them hard on their own. All of them together telling a story about whether a man's mind still holds its load the way it used to. She checked my blood pressure. She listened to my heart. She had me squeeze her hand, push against her palm with my foot, walk a straight line heel to toe across the little strip of tile by the window, which I did without a wobble. And I'll admit I took a bit of pride in that, the same pride I used to take walking a beam 6 stories up without a harness, back when the rules were looser and the men were, I suppose, a good deal more foolish. When we were done, she sat back down and looked at her notes, and then looked at me, and she said, "Harold, you're sharp as a tack, sharper than half the men I see who are 20 years younger than you." I said, "Good. Write that down, plain." She said she would. She said the words for it, told me the reasoning score, told me it was the same as it had been in the spring and the same as it had been the year before that. No change, no slippage, nothing a specialist would ever look at twice. I asked her, once she'd finished writing, whether she'd be willing to add a line to the file, something about the visit being requested by me directly, not referred by anybody, not prompted by any concern raised by a family member or a caregiver, just my own decision on my own timeline. She looked up at that. She said, "Is somebody raising concerns about you, Harold?" I told her the truth, which was that I did not know yet, not for certain, but that I had reason to think somebody might be laying groundwork to raise them soon, and that I would rather have 2 years of clean, dated, unprompted evaluations sitting in a file before that ever happened than try to scramble one together after the fact. She wrote it down without another question. She said, "That's smart. Most people wait until they need the paper trail to start building it." I said, "I've poured enough concrete to know you don't wait for the inspector to show up before you check your rebar." She smiled at that, the first real smile of the visit. And she gave me the printed summary before I left, her signature at the bottom, the date stamped clean at the top. I folded it once, careful, and put it in my jacket pocket next to where the blue ribbon usually rides. And I walked back down those creaking stairs, feeling something I hadn't felt in a few weeks, which was something close to steady ground. I sat in my truck in the parking lot a minute before I started it, and then I called Craig Dunn. Craig's been my attorney going on 9 years, ever since I had him draw up the first version of my living trust. And he's the same man who sat across the table from me in the spring of 2024, when I had him restate the whole thing top to bottom. I told his office I wanted to speak with him directly, not the paralegal, and they put me through inside of 5 minutes, which tells you something about how Craig runs his practice. I told him I had a fresh evaluation from Dr. Ayala, dated that morning, and I wanted it added to my file alongside the others. He said, "Of course, send it on over. I'll have Denise scan it in today." Then he was quiet a second, and he said, "Harold, is there a reason you're doing this again so soon?" I told him the same thing I'd told her, that I had reason to believe somebody was building towards something, though I didn't have proof yet of exactly what shape it would take. I told him about the pamphlets. I told him about the wellness call from Rhonda, and about Kevin standing in my shop, asking me who handled my finances these days. I told him I wasn't accusing anybody of anything outright, not yet, but that I had learned a long time ago in business that when 3 different signals point the same direction, you don't wait around for a 4th one before you check your footing. Craig didn't rush to comfort me, and he didn't rush to alarm me either, which is exactly why I've kept him this long. He said, "Well, the trust you restated in 2024 is about as tight as I know how to write one. The capacity language in there requires 2 independent physicians, not 1, and neither of them can have any prior relationship with anyone petitioning for a change. And the forfeiture provision is still in there exactly the way you wanted it." I remember the day we did that, Harold. You were very particular about the wording. I told him I remembered it too. I remembered sitting in his office that spring, with the windows open and a hawk circling out over the field behind the building. And I remembered telling him I wanted language that didn't just protect me if somebody ever tried to move against my wishes while I was still capable of speaking for myself. I wanted language that cost something to the person who tried it and failed. Craig had asked me then if I had a particular person in mind, and I'd told him no. Not specifically, just that I'd built a business long enough to know that money sitting still eventually draws somebody's attention, and I wanted the fence built high before I ever needed to lean on it. He said, "You want me to pull the file and refresh myself on the exact language, just in case?" I told him yes. I told him I hoped to never need a single word of it, that there was still a chance this was nothing. 3 unrelated things that happened to land close together in time, the kind of coincidence that spooks a man who's gotten cautious in his old age. But I told him I would rather have my attorney holding a sharp tool he never has to use than a dull one he reaches for too late. Before we hung up, he asked me one more thing. He asked if I wanted him to reach out to anybody, maybe have a quiet word, let it be known through the right channels that my affairs were in good order and well documented. I told him no, not yet. I told him I wanted this handled the way I've handled every difficult job in my life, quietly, thoroughly, and without tipping my hand until the tipping actually mattered. He said that was fine by him and that he'd have the medical report filed by end of day. I drove home with the truck windows down, warm air coming through, and I thought about how strange a thing it is to spend a morning proving to a piece of paper that your own mind still belongs to you. Strange, and a little bit sad if I let myself sit in it too long, which I did not intend to do. I have never been a man who sits in a feeling when there's still daylight left to work by. What I did not expect, pulling into my own driveway that afternoon, was to find an envelope already waiting in my mailbox, official looking, a return address I did not recognize. The kind of thick cream-colored paper that only ever means one thing when it shows up unannounced at a man's front gate. I sat in the truck a minute with it in my hand before I opened the door, turning it over once the way I'd turned that first mismailed pamphlet over weeks before. And I thought, whatever this is, I am about to find out exactly how far this had gone. I sat there a minute with that envelope in my hand before I let myself open it, because I have learned in 70 years that some doors you open slow, not because you're scared of what's behind them, but because a man who's been expecting a thing his whole life gets one chance to meet it. Calm, and I did not intend to waste that chance shaking in a truck cab in my own driveway. I slid a thumb under the flap and tore it clean, no hurry in it, and I pulled out 3 folded pages of the kind of language lawyers write when they want a thing to sound reasonable that isn't reasonable at all. It was a notice. A petition had been filed down at the Marshall County Courthouse, asking the court to appoint a guardian over my person and my property on account of concerns about my capacity to manage my own affairs. My name was right there at the top of it, and lower down, the name of the petitioner, and it was Kevin's name sitting in that blank, plain as a nail driven straight, with Rhonda's signature under his as a supporting party. There was a hearing date typed in near the bottom, still some weeks out, and a line telling me I had the right to retain counsel and to contest the petition if I so chose. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time. I read it twice because I wanted to feel exactly what it felt like to hold in my two hands the proof of something I had been half hoping, right up until that moment, was only an old man's suspicion getting ahead of itself. It wasn't. It was real, and it had a case number, and it had been sitting in a filing cabinet down at that courthouse for however many days before the county ever got around to mailing me my copy. I want to tell you, the anger came. I won't pretend it didn't. It came up through my chest the way heat comes up off a slab you've just poured, sudden and close and hard to stand near. But I have run crews for 40 years, and one thing I learned early is that the man who yells on a job site is never the man who fixes the problem. The man who fixes the problem is the one who sets his jaw, walks the perimeter, and figures out exactly where the load is sitting wrong. So I sat there in my truck, in my own driveway, engine ticking as it cooled, and I let the anger come up, and I let it pass back down. And by the time it had passed, I was already thinking about who to call first. I called Craig Dunn before I even walked in the house. He picked up on the second ring, which told me his office had already gotten word, because attorneys down at that courthouse talk to each other, same as contractors talk to each other on a supply run, and word travels. He said, "Harold, I take it you got your copy today." I told him I had it open on my lap right that second. He said, "I was going to call you myself this afternoon, once I had the filing in hand proper, but since you've got it, let's go through it now." He walked me through it plain, no dressing it up and no scaring me either, which is exactly the kind of man I want standing between me and trouble. He said the petition alleged a pattern of what it called cognitive decline, referenced some visit Rhonda claimed to have made checking on my well-being, and referenced a family member, meaning Kevin, expressing what the filing called escalating concern over recent months. He said it was thin. He said petitions like this usually are thin, right up until the moment somebody with money and time decides to make them thick, and that we should assume Kevin intended to make it thick, because a man does not file a thing like this on a whim. I asked him straight out, "Can they take anything from me before there's ever a hearing?" He said no, not without an emergency order, and there was nothing in what Kevin filed that came close to justifying one of those. No allegation of immediate danger, nothing but soft language about my age and my habits. He said the court would set a date, both sides would present, and until then, nothing about my accounts or my trust changed 1 inch. I told him that was good to hear, because I intended to keep signing my own checks and driving my own truck right up until a judge with actual authority told me otherwise, and not one day before. Then he asked me, careful, the way he does when he wants to make sure I've thought a thing all the way through. He said, "Harold, you understand once this is filed, it isn't quiet anymore. It's a public record. Anybody who wants to look can see your name on a guardianship petition down at that courthouse." I told him I understood that fine. I told him I'd rather my name be on a public record showing I fought a false petition and won than have no record at all and let people whisper whatever they pleased in the dark. I have poured enough concrete in my life to know that a thing done in the open, with the form set square and the pour witnessed by anybody who cares to watch, is a thing nobody can argue with later. A pour done quiet, in the dark, with nobody checking the mix, that's the one that cracks on you in the first hard freeze. Craig said that was exactly the right way to look at it, and that he wanted to move fast on our end, not because we were behind, but because he liked being ahead. He said the trust language I'd had him draft back in 2024 required 2 independent physicians for any capacity finding, neither with a prior relationship to any petitioning party, and he intended to have that requirement front and center the moment we filed our response. He said doctor. Ayala's report from just days before the petition was filed would carry real weight, dated the way it was, unprompted the way it was, and he wanted a second, wholly independent evaluation lined up on top of it, so the court would have 2 clean opinions instead of 1, neither of them touched by anybody with a stake in the outcome. I told him to set it up. I told him I'd walk into any doctor's office in the state and answer every last question they put to me, same as I'd already done for Dr. Ayala, because a man with nothing to hide does not flinch from being looked at closely. He said he'd have his office reach out to a specialist over in the next county who did these evaluations regular for the court and had no connection to anybody in our family, and he'd get me an appointment inside the week. Before we hung up, I asked him one more thing. I asked him whether, in his experience, a petition like this usually came out of real worry or out of something else. He was quiet a second, and then he said, "In 9 years of doing this work, Harold, the ones that come with a hearing date already lined up, filed clean and proper with an attorney behind them, those are rarely about worry. Worry usually looks messier than this. This looks planned." I told him I'd come to the same conclusion on my own, walking my shop floor these last few weeks, and that planning was a thing I understood better than most people, having done it my whole working life, and that I intended to outplan whoever was behind this, one step at a time, same as I'd outplanned every difficult job I'd ever taken on. I hung up the phone and sat in the truck a while longer before I finally went inside. The evening was coming down soft over the field behind the house. That gold kind of light that used to fall across my wife's garden bed before the weeds took it back over, and I looked at that light a long minute, and I thought about how a man builds a whole life, board by board, wire by wire, and how there's always somebody standing off to one side, waiting to see if the roof will hold long enough for them to walk in underneath it once he's too tired to hold the ladder anymore. I folded the petition back along its creases, careful, and I carried it inside and laid it flat on the kitchen table next to the folder I'd already started, the one with the pamphlets and the phone call and the shop visit all written down, plain in my own hand. I looked at that folder a long moment, 3 separate things sitting together now, with a 4th on top of them, and I thought, well, there it is. There's the shape of it, finally out in the open, where I can see the whole thing instead of just the corners. I did not know yet exactly what was driving Kevin to reach for a thing this serious, what debt or what trouble was pushing him toward a courthouse, instead of just waiting his turn like everybody else in this world has to. But I intended to find out. I have never once in my life signed off on a job without knowing what was holding the weight underneath it, and I was not about to start now, not with my own name sitting on a docket down at that courthouse, and not with a hearing date already circled on a calendar I had not agreed to. I poured myself 2 fingers that night, same glass I always use, and I sat at that kitchen table a good while with the folder open in front of me, and I thought about my wife and how she used to say a man shows you exactly who he is the moment he thinks nobody's counting. Somebody was about to find out I'd been counting the whole time. I sat there another minute with the glass empty in front of me, and then I got up and rinsed it and set it in the rack, because a man still has to get up in the morning, no matter what's sitting in a folder on his kitchen table. Craig's office called 2 days later to set the 2nd evaluation. And they got me in that same week, over in the next county, a low brick building with a parking lot half empty and a receptionist who didn't know my name from any other name on her list, which suited me fine. The doctor who saw me was a woman named Dr. Okafor, quick eyes, quicker pen, and she didn't waste my time or hers with small talk about the weather. She had me count backward from 100 by 7s. She had me draw a clock face and set the hands to a time she gave me. She asked me the date, the president, the name of the county I lived in, and then she asked me to tell her, in my own words, what a trust was and what a power of attorney did, which I thought was a fair question to ask an old contractor, since most men my age couldn't tell you the difference between the two if you paid them. I told her plain. I told her a trust holds property for somebody, so it passes the way they intend, without a court picking through it. And a power of attorney lets somebody act for you while you're still living, but only as far as you let them, and only until you say otherwise or until you're gone. She wrote that down without a word of reaction, and then she asked me who currently held either one of mine. I told her nobody but me held my power of attorney, that I had never signed one over to a living soul, and that my attorney was the only other person who so much as knew where the paperwork sat. She asked me why I thought somebody had filed a petition asking a court to appoint a guardian over me. I told her the truth, that I believed my son had money trouble he hadn't told me about, and that I believed he'd rather have a judge hand him the keys to my affairs than ever come sit at my table and ask me straight what was going on. She looked up at that. She didn't say anything to it. She just wrote a little longer than she had. for the other answers, and then she thanked me for my time and said her report would go to the court and to my attorney both. I drove home from that appointment with the windows down again, same as before, because it had turned into that kind of warm, and I thought about how strange it was that I'd now sat across from two different doctors in the same short stretch of time, both of them strangers, both of them asking me the same handful of questions in different words, and both of them, I had no doubt, about to write down the same plain answer. A man's mind is either sound or it isn't. It doesn't take 2 visits to know which. It takes 2 visits to prove it to people who'd rather not believe it. Craig called me that evening once Dr. Okafor's report had come across his desk. He said the 2 reports lined up clean, word for word in substance if not in phrasing, both finding me fully capable of managing my own affairs. No diminished capacity, no cognitive concern worth naming. He said he'd already filed our response to the petition, both reports attached, and that he intended to ask the court to consider dismissing the whole thing outright once the hearing date came around, rather than let it drag into some drawn-out back and forth. I told him that sounded right to me. He said, "Harold, I'll be honest with you. In 9 years, I've seen a handful of these get thrown out before they ever really got started, once the medical picture is this clean on one side and this thin on the other." I told him I was glad to hear it, but that I wasn't going to spend the weeks between now and that hearing sitting around congratulating myself. I told him I intended to keep my eyes open the whole way through, because a man who lets his guard down the second he thinks he's won is usually the same man standing in the rubble wondering what happened. After we hung up, I sat at the table a while with both reports laid out side by side, Dr. Ayala's and Dr. Okafor's, and I got to thinking about how close I'd come to never having that first one at all. If I hadn't found that pamphlet stuffed in with my flyer that day, if I hadn't gone in and asked Dr. Ayala flat out for a note just to settle my own mind, I'd have been standing in front of a judge with nothing in my hand but my own word, up against whatever story Kevin and Rhonda had built to hang on that petition. I thought about that a long moment, and then I made a decision sitting right there at that table, one I intended to keep for as long as I had breath left to keep it. I decided I wasn't going to wait for trouble to come knocking again before I went and had myself looked at. I was going to do this every year from here on, same time, same doctor if he'd have me, whether anybody was circling or not. Not because I doubted my own mind, because a man who owns a piece of equipment worth protecting doesn't wait for it to break down before he has it serviced. He puts it on a schedule, and he sticks to the schedule, and then nobody ever gets to stand in front of him one day and say the machine hadn't been checked in years. I called Dr. Ayala's office the next morning and told the girl who answered I wanted to set up a standing appointment once a year going forward for what I called a general capacity check, and I wanted it on the books permanent so I wouldn't have to think about it again until it came due. She said that was unusual, but not a problem, and she got me down for the same week the following year before we even hung up. I felt something settle in my chest doing that. Some small, sturdy thing, the same feeling I used to get walking a foundation after the forms came off clean and square. Whatever came next, whatever Kevin and Rhonda thought they had waiting for them down at that courthouse, I was going to walk into every single year of the rest of my life with a fresh piece of paper in a drawer somewhere saying my mind was my own. Let them try to argue with a stack of those going back a decade. I was still sitting there with that decided when the phone rang again, later than Craig usually called, and I glanced at the screen expecting his name. It wasn't his name, it was Katie's, and it caught me square, because Katie hadn't called my phone since before that wedding, not once, not even a courtesy word after the way that day had gone. I sat looking at it ring a second time before I picked it up, and something in my chest told me, before I'd even said hello, that whatever she was calling about wasn't small. I picked up on the third ring, and I kept my voice level, the way I would answer any call, because whatever was coming, I didn't want her hearing worry in it first. Katie, Dad, just that word, and already I could hear something under it, something tight. "Do you have a minute? I've got all night. What's going on?" She was quiet a second, like she was deciding where to start, and then she said, "I was over at Kevin and Rhonda's this afternoon. Justin had a job out that way, so I rode along, figured I'd drop off some casserole dishes Rhonda left at our place after Easter." Kevin wasn't home. Rhonda was out back with the dog. I let myself in the side door like I always do, and I set the dishes on the counter, and there was a laptop open on the kitchen table, and a stack of paper next to it, and I wasn't snooping, Dad. I want you to know that. I wasn't going through anything. It was just sitting there open, and my eye caught the top sheet before I even meant to look. What was it? It was a spreadsheet, printed out. Mullins Excavation and Concrete, that's the header, and then columns underneath it, account names, dates, amounts owed, and a column at the far right that just said, days past due. Dad, some of those numbers went past 180. There were red cells, a lot of red cells, and there was a separate page under it, some kind of letter from a bank. I only saw the letterhead before I made myself stop looking, but it said something about a security interest in equipment, and I know enough from doing books for Justin's crew to know what that phrase means. I sat back in my chair at the kitchen table, the folder with the petition and the doctor's letters still sitting closed in front of me, and I felt something in my chest go still and cold, the way it does when I'm standing over a form right before a pour, and I notice, quiet, that one stake isn't set the way it should be. You're sure it said Mullins Excavation? I'm sure. It's Kevin's company letterhead. Dad, I've seen it on his invoices 100 times. This wasn't some old paper he was holding on to. The dates on it were recent. Some were from this month. Did Rhonda see you look at it? No. I put the dishes down, I said hello to her through the screen door, told her I couldn't stay, and I left. But I've been sitting in the truck outside our place for 20 minutes now because I can't make myself go inside and act normal, and I don't know why I'm calling you instead of calling him, except that some part of me already knows what he'd say if I did, and I don't think I'd believe it. I let that sit a second before I answered, because I wanted to choose my words the way I'd choose a beam, not by what was closest to hand, but by what would actually carry weight. Katie, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just listen to the whole thing before you say anything back. Your stepfather filed a petition down at the courthouse a few weeks ago. He's asking a judge to name a guardian over me. Him, most likely, or Rhonda alongside him. Says I'm not fit to manage my own affairs anymore. The line went quiet long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. He did what? You heard me right the first time. Dad, why would he? You're the sharpest man I know. You still keep your own books. You still drive to the hardware store and argue with the kid at the counter about the price of conduit. This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense if you think it's about me. It starts making a different kind of sense if you think about what a man does when he owes more money than he can find a way to pay. A petition like that, if a judge signs off on it, hands somebody control over another person's accounts. Every dollar, every asset, and a man standing under a debt he can't climb out of, he starts looking around for a rope, any rope, even one tied to his own father. You think he's trying to get at your money because his company's in trouble. I think it's looking that way, yes. And what you just told me about that spreadsheet, that's the first hard piece of it I've had put in front of me. Up until tonight, I had a feeling, a strong one, but a feeling's not proof of anything. What you saw on that table, that's proof of something. Not proof of what he's after, not yet, but proof that there's real trouble sitting underneath whatever he told that judge about me. I feel sick, she said, and her voice cracked a little on the last word, which is a thing I hadn't heard from my daughter since she was a girl. I've been so angry at you the last month and a half, since the wedding. I didn't call you, I didn't answer when you tried calling me. I let Kevin and Rhonda tell me their whole version of things, that you'd gotten difficult, that you were slipping, that giving him the walk instead of you was the kind thing to do, because you'd have been embarrassed up there in front of everybody if you got confused. I believe that. I stood in that barn and I let you drive home alone, and I didn't even walk out to the truck to say goodbye. And now I'm sitting here finding out he's been building a case against you the whole time, and I don't know what to do with that. I closed my eyes a second because that part of it, hearing her say it plain, cost me more than the petition itself ever had. But I didn't let it show in my voice. My wife used to say, a man can carry two things in his hands at once if he's careful how he stacks them. And I stacked that hurt up right then and set it aside for later, because Katie needed something steadier from me in that moment than my own wounded feelings. I'm not going to pretend that day didn't land on me hard, I told her. It did, but I didn't call you tonight to relitigate a wedding. I called, or you called me, because something real is sitting on your brother's kitchen table, and I think you and I both need to understand it a lot better before either one of us does anything else. What do we do? First thing, you don't say a word to Kevin or Rhonda about what you saw. Not one word. Not tonight, not tomorrow. If there's something crooked holding that debt up, and they know you've seen the shape of it, They'll clean the table off before anybody official ever gets a look at it. I need you to just carry what you saw quiet for a little while. That feels wrong. Not telling him, I know it does. But think about it this way. If your brother's in trouble bad enough to reach for a guardianship petition against his own father, he's already decided some lines don't matter to him anymore. A man in that position, if he thinks the walls are closing, he doesn't come clean. He speeds up. I'd rather we understood the whole shape of what he owes and who he owes it to before he has any chance to react. She was quiet again, and then she said, "There's a family meeting Rhonda's been talking about setting up." She called it a chance for everybody to sit down and talk through her words, concerns about your living situation going forward. She wanted to do it before the court date. I told her I'd come. Good, come. And bring your eyes open, same as you did today at that kitchen table. Only this time, you'll know what you're looking for. Dad, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honest. Back before the wedding, Rhonda had me sign something. She said it was just paperwork, something about a family support declaration, in case anything ever came up with your care down the road, so the family could coordinate without fighting over it. I signed it in about 2 minutes flat in her kitchen, standing up, because I trusted her, and because I didn't think it mattered. Do you know what that is? Something in me went very still, hearing that. The way a man goes still when he hears a truck idle wrong and knows, before he's even popped the hood, that it's going to be an expensive afternoon. No, I told her, I don't know what's in it, but I think you better find that piece of paper again, Katie, and this time read every word of it before that family meeting, not after. I will. I promise you I will. She let out a breath I could hear clear through the phone. I'm sorry, Dad, for the aisle, for all the weeks after. I don't know yet what all of this means, but I know I got some of it wrong, and I'm not going to wait until it's all sorted out to say that to you. We'll get to that, I said, gentle as I could make it, once we know what we're standing on. Right now I need you rested, and I need you sharp for whatever Rhonda's got planned. Go on inside, kiss your husband, get some sleep. Okay. A pause. I love you too, honey. I set the phone down on the table next to the folder, and I sat there a long minute in the quiet of that kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the old clock over the stove tick through its seconds. And I thought about how a single afternoon, one casserole dish carried through a side door, had cracked open more than 6 weeks of careful documenting ever had. I thought about a signed piece of paper, sitting somewhere in my daughter's house that she hadn't read closely enough the day she put her name to it. And I thought about a spreadsheet full of red cells on a kitchen table 2 miles from where I sat. 2 pieces, neither one finished yet. But for the first time since that pamphlet had turned up folded into my flyer, I could feel the whole shape of the thing starting to come up out of the dark, the way a foundation starts to show itself once the forms go up, and you can finally see where the walls are going to stand. I picked up the phone again and called Craig Dunn, even though it was well past a decent hour to be calling a man's office line, because some things don't wait for morning. Craig picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been sitting at his own kitchen table, same as I had, going over something he couldn't set down either. Harold, bit late for you. Katie called me tonight, I said. My daughter. She was at Kevin and Rhonda's this afternoon, dropping off some dishes. And there was a laptop open on the table, and a printed spreadsheet next to it. Mullins Excavation and concrete letterhead, columns of accounts, dates, amounts owed, a column marked days past due, and red cells running out past 180. Underneath it, a letter from a bank talking about a security interest in equipment. Craig didn't say anything for a second, and I could hear a pen tapping slow against paper on his end. She's certain of what she saw. She does books for her husband's crew. She knows what a security interest means. She didn't touch anything, didn't linger, just saw the top sheet before she made herself look away. That's not evidence yet, Harold, not the kind a judge weighs. It's a daughter's memory of a piece of paper on a kitchen table, but it tells us where to point a shovel, and that's worth more tonight than you might think. I want to bring in somebody who does forensic accounting work for me on the estate side. Woman named Glenda Smith. She's pulled apart worse tangles than this one. If there's a real paper trail behind that spreadsheet, liens filed, judgments entered, notices sent, she'll find it in the public record without anybody needing to sneak a second look at Kevin's kitchen table. Do it, I said, whatever it costs. There's something else your daughter told you that matters more than the spreadsheet, and I want to make sure you caught it. She said Rhonda had her sign something before the wedding, a family support declaration. I caught it. I don't like the sound of that phrase, Harold. Not from Rhonda, and not timed the way it's timed. I've seen documents wearing names like that before, and they don't always say what a person thinks they're signing. Sometimes a family support declaration is nothing, a courtesy statement saying the family's aware of a situation. And sometimes it's drafted to say the signer supports a particular course of action regarding a parent's care, which is a very different thing to hand a judge. Katie's going to find it and read it. She promised me that tonight. Good. Tell her to bring me a copy the second she has one in her hands, before that family meeting Rhonda's setting up. I want to know exactly what she signed before she walks into a room with the two people who talked her into signing it. I told him I would, and we talked another few minutes about the standing appointment I'd set with Dr. Ayala, and he said that was about the smartest thing I'd done since this whole business started. A man building his own record year over year instead of scrambling for one paper at the last minute. Then we said our goodnights, and I sat there a while longer with the phone dark in front of me, thinking about Glenda Smith, a name I'd never heard before that night. About to go digging through the wreckage of my son's company, same as a man walking a demolition site, looking for what's still standing under the dust. 2 days went by before Katie called again. I was out back replacing a fence board that had finally given up after some 20 years of weather, and I heard my phone going in my jacket pocket where I had hung it over a post. And I pulled off my gloves and answered it, standing right there in the yard with the shovel still in the dirt. Dad, I found it. The declaration. Yes. It was filed in with our wedding paperwork, if you can believe that, tucked in behind the caterer's contract like it belonged there. I read it 4 times before I understood what I was looking at. And, Dad, I need you to sit down for this, because I did not know, I swear to you, I did not know. I'm standing in the yard with a shovel, honey. Just tell me, it's 2 pages. The first page is soft, family language, says the undersigned supports coordinated family involvement in decisions regarding Harold Adams's health, housing, and financial affairs going forward, given concerns about his independent capacity. That's the sentence, Dad. Concerns about his independent capacity. And I signed under that sentence standing in Rhonda's kitchen in about 90 seconds because she told me it was just something for the family file. And the second page. The second page names Kevin as the family member the declaration recommends the court consider as primary decision maker. And it says the undersigned, that's me, has personally observed and can attest to a decline in Harold Adams's day-to-day functioning, consistent with the concerns described. Dad, I never said that to anybody. I never observed any decline. I've been mad at you. I've been distant. But I never once thought you were declining, and there's my signature under a sentence claiming I watched it happen with my own eyes. I stood there in the yard a long moment, the shovel handle cool under my palm, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger, something colder and steadier than anger, the feeling of a man finally looking straight at a load he'd only been guessing the weight of before. They used you, I said, not just against me, they used you as a witness against me, and they never told you that's what the paper said. I feel like such a fool. I stood at that wedding and I gave Kevin your walk because I believed the story that you'd gotten difficult, and the whole time there was a piece of paper with my name on it saying I'd personally seen you slipping, and I never said that. I never even thought it. Somebody just wrote it down and put it in front of me between the flower order and the seating chart. Did you sign anything else that day? Think hard. Just that. I've gone through every folder in the house twice now, looking for more. Then that's the one that matters. Get a copy to Craig today, like he asked. Don't wait. I already scanned it. I'm sending it to his office right now, while I've still got you on the phone, so you know I'm not going to sit on this a single hour. I heard her voice catch, just slightly, the way it had on the phone 2 nights before. Dad, the family meeting. Rhonda called this morning and set it for Thursday, out at their place. She wants everybody there, you included. She made it sound like a chance to clear the air before the court date, like it's some kind of kindness she's offering you. I'll be there, you're sure, after everything. Katie, I built 40 years of business standing in rooms with men who had already decided how the meeting was going to go before I walked in the door. And every single time, the way I beat them was by showing up anyway, calm, on time, with my own eyes open. I'm not going to start hiding from a kitchen table now. I'll be there too. And Dad, this time, I'm not walking in, believing whatever story gets handed to me first. I already learned that lesson once. I don't intend to learn it twice. I told her I loved her, and she said it back, steadier than she had 2 nights before, and we hung up, and I stood in that yard a good while longer before I picked the shovel back up. The fence board could wait another hour. I had some thinking to do, first about Thursday, about a kitchen table 2 miles down the road where my son and his wife were fixing to sit me down and tell me, to my face, some version of a story that a signed and buried piece of paper had already proven false. I finished the fence before dark anyway, because a man doesn't leave a job half done just because his mind's elsewhere. And that night, I laid out my good shirt for Thursday and went to bed early, wanting to walk into that kitchen, rested, clear-headed, and ready to listen to every single word my son had to say. I walked into Kevin and Rhonda's kitchen on Thursday evening, wearing my good shirt, hair combed, boots wiped clean on their mat before I ever crossed the threshold, because a man shows respect for a room even when the people in it haven't earned his trust. Rhonda had the table set up like a meeting, and not a supper, no plates, just a legal pad in front of her chair and 4 glasses of water nobody was going to drink. Kevin stood by the counter with his arms crossed, not sitting yet, like he wanted the option of leaving his own kitchen if things went sideways. Katie was already there when I arrived, perched on the edge of a chair near the window, and she caught my eye for just a second and gave me the smallest nod, the kind 2 men give each other before they walk into a room they both know is rigged. "Dad, thanks for coming," Rhonda said, standing to greet me like I was a client walking into her office instead of her father-in-law walking into her kitchen. "We just want tonight to be a chance for everybody to talk honestly. No lawyers, no papers, just family." "I appreciate that," I said, and I sat down across from her, because a man who sits calm in a chair someone else set up for him is harder to rattle than a man who stays standing and defensive. "Go ahead." Rhonda opened with a speech that had the smooth, rehearsed shape of something she'd practiced in front of a mirror. She talked about love, about how nobody in that room wanted anything but what was best for me, about how watching a parent age is one of the hardest things a family goes through, and how the petition wasn't punishment. It was protection, a net strung up under a man in case he ever stumbled. She used the word concerns 4 separate times. I counted, because counting is a thing a man does with his hands when he needs somewhere to put them, instead of on the table. "And we have documentation," she went on, sliding a folder toward the center of the table without opening it. "Statements from people who've observed changes, including from Katie." Katie sat up straight at that. "I'd like to talk about that, actually." Rhonda's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "Of course. I signed something back before the wedding," Katie said, and her voice was steady in a way I was proud of, steadier than mine might have been at her age in a room like that. "You told me it was a family file, just paperwork, so everybody could coordinate if Dad ever needed help down the road. I signed it standing up in about 2 minutes because I trusted you. I read it properly 2 days ago, all the way through, both pages. Katie, I don't think this is the time to..." "It says I personally observed a decline in Dad's day-to-day functioning," Katie said, right over her, and I watched Rhonda's jaw set. "It says I can attest to that." "Rhonda, I never said that to you. I never said it to anybody, because I never saw it, because it isn't true. Somebody wrote that sentence and put my name underneath it, and I want to know who." The kitchen went quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on behind Kevin. He hadn't moved from the counter, but his arms had come uncrossed, and he was looking at Rhonda instead of at me, which told me plenty. "It's standard language," Rhonda said, too fast. "Attorneys draft these things with broad phrasing so they hold up. It wasn't meant to put words in your mouth, Katie. It was meant to reflect the general concern the family had already discussed. I never discussed any concern with you about Dad declining, not once. We talked about the wedding. We talked about seating charts. You never once sat me down and told me you were worried about Dad's mind, and if you had, I'd have told you I didn't believe it, because I don't." I let that sit a moment before I spoke, because Katie didn't need me stepping in to finish her sentence for her. "Rhonda," I said, quiet, who drafted that declaration. "Our attorney." "Which attorney?" She hesitated just long enough that I knew the answer mattered to her more than she wanted it to. "A man Kevin's worked with, on business matters." "On the excavation business," I said, not a question. Kevin finally spoke, and his voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager arguing about a truck he wanted and couldn't afford. "Dad, can we not turn this into an interrogation? We asked you here to talk, not to sit across a table and get cross-examined like I'm on trial. Nobody's putting you on trial, son. I'm asking a simple question. Your attorney, the one who drafted a legal document with your sister's name on it, is the same one handling your business affairs. That's worth knowing, that's all. It's not unusual for a family to use one attorney for multiple things, Rhonda said. It's efficient. How's the business doing, Kevin? I asked, and I kept my voice easy, the way I'd have asked any man across a job site how a project was coming along, because sometimes the plainest question is the one that does the most work. I watched something flicker across his face. Quick, the look of a man who'd been braced for a different line of attack and got hit somewhere he hadn't guarded. It's fine, he said. Busy season, just fine. Dad, why does that matter right now? Because your sister found a spreadsheet on this table 2 days ago, I said. And I didn't raise my voice at all, didn't need to, because the words did their own work in that quiet room. Accounts past due out past 6 months. A bank letter about a security interest in your equipment. I'm asking you plain, in front of your wife and your sister, because I'd rather hear it from you than piece it together secondhand. Is Mullen's excavation in trouble? Rhonda's face went a shade I hadn't seen on her before. Something between fury and fear, and she turned on Katie so fast her chair scraped the floor. You went through our things. I saw a laptop open on your kitchen table when I brought over a casserole dish, Katie said, not backing an inch. I didn't go through anything. It was sitting right there. Kevin had gone very still by the counter, and I watched him do the thing I'd seen 100 men do over 40 years of running crews. The moment a man realizes the ground under him has already shifted, and there's no use pretending it hasn't. His shoulders dropped. Something in his face let go. Yeah, he said. Quiet. We're in trouble. Bad trouble. 2 banks are calling. I've got a loader and a mixer truck, both got liens filed against them. And I've been 3 weeks behind on payroll twice this year already. And I've been covering it out of savings that ran dry back in the spring. Kevin, Rhonda said. Sharp, a warning. No, he said. And something in him seemed to give way all at once. The way a wall gives way after you've pulled the load-bearing post out from under it and it just takes a while to fall. No, they're going to find out anyway, Rhonda. Glenda Smith's already digging. Isn't that what you said, Dad? Some accountant Craig Dunn hired. It's going to come out one way or another. Might as well be my own mouth that says it. He looked at me straight for maybe the first time all evening. I've already got a buyer lined up. For the equipment, the loader, the trucks, 2 of the mixers, and the county contracts that go with them. Man out of the next county over's been asking for a year. I finally called him back last week. If I can move fast enough, I can clear the liens and walk away with something, instead of watching the bank take it all. Move fast, I repeated. Before what? He didn't answer that, but he didn't need to, because I already understood the shape of it whole, the way a man understands a structure the moment he sees where the cracks run. Move fast before a judge decided anything about a petition. Move fast before anybody looked too close at where the money from my accounts might have been headed to cover a hole he'd already decided was too deep to climb out of honestly. I sat there in that kitchen and felt something settle in my chest. Not surprise exactly. More like the quiet, heavy certainty a man feels when a suspicion he'd been carrying finally sets its full weight down and stops being a guess. Rhonda had her hand pressed flat against the table, like she was trying to hold the whole conversation down by force. This isn't what tonight was supposed to be about. I think it's exactly what tonight was about, I said, standing, and I reached for my coat off the back of the chair. I think I've heard enough for one evening. Katie. She stood too, quick, gathering her purse off the floor beside her chair. Kevin didn't say anything else. He just stood there by the counter with his arms hanging loose at his sides, looking, for the first time in longer than I could remember, less like a man running a business and more like a boy who'd finally been caught holding something he shouldn't have. Rhonda opened her mouth like she wanted to say something that would put the room back the way it had been 10 minutes earlier, but there wasn't a way to do that anymore, and I think some part of her knew it. I walked out through the same side door Katie had come through with that casserole dish 2 days before, and she followed right behind me, and neither of us said a word until we were both standing out by my truck in the cool evening air, the kitchen light still burning behind us through the window. I stood there by the tailgate a minute before either of us said anything, the night gone properly dark now, just the porch light and that one kitchen window still burning gold behind us. You okay? I asked her. I don't know what I am. She wrapped her arms around herself even though it wasn't cold enough for that. I keep replaying it, the way he just stood there and let go of it, like a man setting down something too heavy to carry another step. Part of me wanted to hug him, Dad, That's the part that scares me. That's not a thing to be scared of. That's just you being his stepdaughter. He lied to me for months. He let me sign something with my name on a lie about you, and some part of me still wants to go back in there and help him fix it. Wanting to help somebody and letting them use you again aren't the same thing, I said. You can care about your brother and still hand every piece of paper you've got to Craig Dunn. Both things fit in the same chest at once. Took me a lot of years of building things to learn that, but it's true. She almost smiled at that, tired around the eyes, but real. You sound like you've been saving that line up. Might have been. I opened her car door for her, old habit. The kind you do without thinking for your own kid even when she's 30 years past needing it. Go on home, get some sleep. I'll call Craig first thing. Call me after you talk to him. I want to know everything now. No more finding things out on a kitchen table by accident. You'll know everything, I said, and I meant it. And she drove off with her headlights sweeping across the dark field before I climbed into my own truck and headed home down that same stretch of county road I'd driven 100 times, past the turnoff to the barn where all of this had started back in June, past the mailbox where a folded pamphlet had once told me more about my son's intentions than his own mouth ever had. I called Craig Dunn at 8 the next morning, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee going cold in front of me, while I laid it all out. The folder Rhonda had slid across the table without opening, Kevin's arms coming uncrossed, the word buyer landing in that quiet room like a dropped tool. He said it outright, Craig said, and I could hear him writing while he talked. That particular scratch of a pen a lawyer makes when a case just got a whole lot stronger, in front of witnesses, in front of his own wife who tried to stop him. Katie and I both heard it clean. A man in the next county over has been asking to buy the loader, the trucks, 2 of the mixers, and the county contracts that ride along with them. He said he needed to move fast. Move fast, Craig repeated, same way I had in that kitchen. Harold, you understand what that tells a judge. A man who's building a genuine case for his father's safety doesn't need to move fast on liquidating unrelated business assets. A man trying to stay a step ahead of his own creditors does. And a man trying to get his hands on family money before anybody looks too close at where it's headed, he needs to move fastest of all. That's what I figured sitting there, listening to him say it. Glenda Smith's about finished with her report. She's traced the liens, the past due accounts, a pattern of loans coming in and drying up within weeks. And now I can add the buyer, the timeline, all of it, straight from his own mouth at a family meeting his own wife arranged. This isn't a guardianship petition anymore, Harold. It's a paper trail with a motive stapled right to the front of it. When's the hearing? Marshall County Courthouse, 2 weeks from Monday. Judge Holloway's calendar. I'll have everything filed by end of week, Glenda's report. The declaration Katie signed with her sworn statement about what she was actually told. And I want your independent medical evaluation in there too. Current, clean, dated close to the hearing, so nobody can argue it's stale. I sat with that a second, my coffee gone fully cold now, and something in me settled the way a beam settles once you've finally got the last brace welded in place. I want to talk to you about that piece for a minute, Craig. Not just this once. I want to start doing it every year from here on, whatever happens with this hearing. The evaluation. When I had the trust restated back in 2024, I put those 2 clauses in myself, you remember? The dual physician language and the forfeiture piece. I wrote those clauses because I could see trouble coming, even then, not the shape of it, but the weather of it, the way a man who's worked outside his whole life can feel a front moving in before the sky ever changes color. I didn't know it'd be a guardianship petition. I didn't know it'd be my own son standing in his kitchen, admitting he needed my money to save a company he never told me was drowning. But I built that clause like I'd build a footing, deep enough to hold whatever came, because I didn't need to know the exact shape of the load to know a load was coming. That's about the smartest thing I've heard a client say in this whole business, Craig said, and there was something almost like respect in his voice, the kind of respect one careful man has for another. All right, I'll get Dr. Ayala's office on the phone this morning, get you in this week if I can. And Harold, I want you thinking past the hearing too. Whatever happens on that Monday, I think you ought to make the evaluation a standing appointment, once a year on the calendar, whether anybody's challenging you or not because you need it. Because a man who documents his own strength before anybody questions it never has to prove it under pressure later. He's already proved it, quiet, on his own schedule, years running. That's exactly what I was thinking, sitting here with my coffee going cold. Good. Because I'll tell you plain, Harold, I've represented a lot of folks your age fighting off exactly this kind of thing. And the ones who win clean, the ones who walk out of that courthouse with the petition dismissed and their dignity fully intact, they're almost always the ones who started keeping their own records before they ever needed them. You built that habit 2 years early without even knowing why. That's not luck. That's a man who understands foundations. I drove into town 3 days later for the appointment doctor. Ayala's office up on the second floor above the pharmacy. Same building it had always been in, and I sat in that waiting room with my hat in my lap, like I had every year since I'd started this, filling out the same forms, answering the same string of questions about dates and names and simple arithmetic that always felt almost insulting in their plainness until I remembered exactly why I was answering them. Dr. Ayala came out to get me herself, same as always, a steady woman with a quiet, careful way about her. The kind of doctor who looks at you like she's actually listening and not just waiting for her turn to talk. "Harold," she said, shaking my hand. "Craig Dunn's office called ahead. Said this one's a little more urgent than our usual visit." "There's a hearing coming up," I said, following her back to the exam room. "Somebody's decided I might not be fit to run my own affairs anymore." She looked at me a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't pity, just plain assessment. A professional taking the measure of a thing before she says anything about it. Based on what I've seen of you the last 2 years running and what I'm about to see today, I don't think that's going to be much of a fight. That's what I'm hoping. Let's get started then. Same as always. Tell me today's date, and then I want you to count backward from 100 by sevens. And after that, we're going to talk about your memory, your finances, and how you've been sleeping. I answered every question clean and plain, the same way I had every year since I'd first started this practice, not because anybody made me, but because a man who spends his life building things learns early that the strongest structure is the one you can show, not just the one you swear to. Dr. Ayala wrote steadily the whole time, and near the end, she set her pen down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Harold, I'm going to write up a report that says exactly what I'm seeing, which is a man with full capacity, sharp memory, sound judgment, and no clinical indication of decline whatsoever. I'll date it, I'll sign it, and I'll get it over to Craig Dunn's office by tomorrow morning. I appreciate that. I want you to know something else, too." She folded her hands on the desk. "I've had 2 calls this month asking about your file. One from an attorney's office representing your son, wanting to know if I'd be willing to conduct an evaluation on their timeline with their questions. I told them the same thing I'm telling you now, that my evaluations follow my own clinical judgment, not anybody's preferred outcome, and that you'd been coming to me on a regular schedule long before anybody filed anything against you." Something in my chest went quiet and still at that. The particular stillness a man feels when a wall he built years back, not knowing exactly what it was for, turns out to be standing precisely where the storm hit hardest. They tried to get to you first. They tried. It didn't work because there wasn't anything to work with. You'd already been doing this the right way for 2 years before they ever thought to ask. I walked out of that office into the afternoon light with the appointment behind me and the hearing still 2 weeks off, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot a minute before I turned the key, thinking about Craig's words. A man who documents his own strength before anybody questions. It never has to prove it under pressure later. I hadn't known, back in 2024, sitting in a lawyer's office writing clauses into a trust against a trouble I couldn't yet name, that I was laying down exactly this kind of footing. But a man doesn't always need to see the whole blueprint to know he's building something that'll hold. Sometimes he just keeps pouring good concrete year after year, and trusts that when the weight finally comes, the ground underneath it will still be solid. I started the truck and pointed it toward home, and somewhere behind me, up the road and 2 counties over, I knew Kevin was still trying to move fast on a sale that Craig Dunn already had documented down to the date. I had 2 weeks now. 2 weeks to keep my head clear, my paperwork current, and my own conscience settled, and then I was going to walk into the Marshall County Courthouse and let the whole thing get said out loud, in front of a judge, in front of my son, in front of everybody who needed to hear it. I got back from Dr. Ayala's office and set the report on my kitchen table where I could see it, and for 2 days I didn't do much of anything except the ordinary work of living. Fed the dog, fixed a dripping faucet in the downstairs bath, called my supplier about a delivery I didn't even need yet, just to hear a man on the other end talk about lumber and lead times instead of lawyers and hearing dates. A man can only carry so much weight standing still. Sometimes the best thing he can do while he waits is keep his hands busy with something that has nothing to do with the trouble at all. Katie called me on a Thursday evening, and I knew before I even answered that something in her voice had shifted because she didn't say hello first.
She said, "Dad, I need you to stay on the phone with me while I read something out loud, because if I stop, I don't think I'll finish it." "I'm right here," I said, and I sat down slow at the kitchen table. The way you sit down when you
Already sense you're about to hear something that's gonna want you sitting. Craig sent me a copy of my own declaration, the one I signed back in the spring. I never actually read the whole thing, Dad. I read the summary page Kevin printed out for me, the one that talked about coordinating your care and making sure your wishes were respected. And I signed where he told me to sign, because I trusted him, and because it was my brother standing there asking, not some stranger. "I know it," I said. "Go on." She was quiet a second, and I could hear paper rustling on her end, the particular sound of somebody smoothing out pages they've folded and unfolded too many times already that week. "It's not what he told me it was. There's a whole section near the back, Dad. Dense little paragraphs, the kind of language that's built to slide past somebody who's tired and trusts the person handing it to them. It says that if a guardianship is ever established over you, whether contested or not, I'm designating Kevin as," it actually uses this phrase, "the family support coordinator." It says he gets authority to direct distributions from any accounts brought under guardianship management. It says my signature constitutes informed prior consent to that arrangement. Informed prior consent, I repeated, and something cold moved through me. Not surprise, more like watching a suspicion finally get its paperwork filed. He had me sign it before he ever filed anything, Dad, before the petition even existed, so that when it did get filed, there'd already be a piece of paper with my name on it saying I'd thought it through and agreed, ahead of time, to hand him control. It would have looked like a family decision, like I'd sat down and read every word and decided this was right, and I didn't. I read 4 sentences on a summary page my own brother wrote for me, and I trusted him with the rest. I let that sit a moment before I answered her, because some things a father shouldn't rush past just to make his daughter feel better faster. "Katie, I want you to hear me say this plain. That's not a thing you did wrong. That's a thing that was done to you. There's a difference between a man who reads a contract careless and a man who hands his own sister a summary built to keep her from reading it careful. He didn't ask you to trust him. He engineered the trust so you wouldn't have to think, and then he used the not thinking against you. I keep asking myself how I missed it. You missed it the same way anybody misses a crack in a foundation that's been painted over clean. You're not the one who poured the bad concrete, honey. You're not the one who knew where the flaw was and covered it up anyway. That's on him and only him, and I don't want you carrying 1 ounce of it home with you tonight." She let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in her chest, and she started reading. "I already called Craig. I told him I want to submit a statement of my own for the hearing, not just handing him documents anymore. I want to say, in my own words, exactly what I was told when I signed it, and exactly what it actually says, side by side, so the judge can see the gap between them himself. That's a strong thing to do. It's the least I can do. He used my name to build a paper trail that made his lie look like my agreement. I want my name to be the thing that tears it back down." "Then you go ahead and write it exactly like that," I said. "Plain and honest, same as you'd say it to me, sitting across this table. Judges hear enough lawyer language in a week to last them a lifetime. Sometimes the truest thing in a room is one person just saying what actually happened." We talked another few minutes after that. Softer things, whether she'd slept, whether Justin was doing all right with all of it swirling around so close to their own wedding, still fresh in everybody's memory. And by the time we hung up, her voice had settled some. Not healed, but steadier, the way a board settles once you've got it properly braced instead of just leaning against the wall hoping it holds. Craig Dunn called me the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. "Glenda Smith's report is finished and filed," he said. "Complete picture now, Harold. The overdue accounts at Mullins Excavation, going back the better part of a year. 3 separate loans taken out against equipment that was already leveraged twice over, and now the buyer lined up out of the next county, contacted the same week the guardianship petition got filed. She laid the whole timeline out clean as a blueprint. Anybody reading it can see exactly what it was built to do. And Katie's putting in her own statement. She called me last night, near tears, but dead set on it. I told her that statement of hers might end up being the single most persuasive page in the whole filing, because everything else in there is documents and dates. But hers is a daughter standing up and saying, in plain words, I was deceived, and here is precisely how. Judges remember that kind of testimony longer than they remember a spreadsheet. When do we go in? Monday, 10 in the morning, Marshall County Courthouse, Judge Holloway's courtroom. I want you there by 9:30, dressed the way you dress for church, not because anybody doubts you, but because a man walking in calm and put together tells a room something before he ever says a word. Bring nothing but yourself and a clear head. I've got every document, every report, Dr. Ayala's evaluation, all of it filed and ready. This part now, this is my work to carry. Craig, I said, I want to say something to you plain, before Monday gets here and everything starts moving fast. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know I understand what you've done for me these past weeks. Not just the filings, the way you took Kevin's confusion seriously back, before I even understood myself what it was I was looking at. A lot of lawyers would have told an old man to slow down, to be sure, to not go making waves over a pamphlet in a mailbox. You didn't do that. You listened. There was a pause on his end, the kind a careful man takes before he says something he means. Harold, I've been doing this work over 30 years now, and I'll tell you honest, most of the cases that cross my desk, somebody's already lost. The money's gone, the trust's been drained, and I'm just there afterward, sorting through the wreckage, trying to claw back whatever's left. You're one of the rare ones who came to me early enough, and who'd already built the kind of foundation that gave me something solid to stand on and fight from. That trust language you wrote back in 2024, that annual evaluation habit you kept up without anybody making you, that's not luck, Harold. That's a man who spent his whole life understanding that the strongest wall is the one you built before the storm ever showed up on the horizon. I sat there after we hung up, looking out my kitchen window at the fence line running off toward the tree break, the same view I'd been looking at most mornings for going on 40 years now. And I thought about Monday coming, 2 days off now, closing in steady the way a delivery truck closes in on a job site. You can hear it before you can see it. I thought about Katie sitting somewhere in her own kitchen right that minute, writing out in her own hand exactly what her brother had told her and exactly what the paper had actually said, laying the gap between those two things bare for a judge to see. I thought about Kevin, wherever he was, maybe still on the phone with a man in the next county, trying to move fast on a sale that was never going to outrun the report already sitting filed in a courthouse. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the rack to dry. 2 days. I'd spent most of my life finishing jobs on a schedule tighter than that. Foundations poured and framed and roofed inside a single week when the weather cooperated. I knew how to wait out the last stretch of a build without losing my nerve. I went out to the barn, found some small thing that needed doing, and let my hands go to work while the rest of me got ready, quiet and steady, for Monday morning. Monday morning came in clear and cold. The kind of sky you get maybe a dozen times a year, no clouds anywhere, like the weather itself had decided to stay out of the way and let the day be what it was going to be. I put on my good gray suit, the one I'd worn to Eleanor's funeral and not much since, and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror a minute knotting my tie, thinking that a man's hands remember a job even when the rest of him is nervous, because I hadn't tied a necktie in going on 2 years, and my fingers still knew exactly where to go. I got to the Marshall County Courthouse at 9:15, 15 minutes ahead of when Craig told me to be there, because a man doesn't build a career on showing up late to anything that matters. The building was old limestone, the kind they don't cut anymore, with steps worn shallow in the middle from 100 years of people walking up them, carrying their worst days. Craig was waiting on the top step in a dark suit of his own, a leather folder under one arm, thick enough that I could see the edges of paper trying to work their way loose. "You look steady," he said, shaking my hand. "I feel steady," I told him, and it was true. Whatever nerves I might have carried up those steps had settled somewhere on the drive over, replaced by something plainer, the particular calm of a man who's checked his own work 3 times and knows it'll hold weight. Katie was already inside the hallway outside the courtroom, standing with her arms crossed tight over a folder of her own, and when she saw me, she came straight across the marble floor and put both arms around me without a word first. I held on to her a second longer than either of us probably meant to. "I'm glad you're here," I said into her hair. "I wasn't going to let you walk into this alone," she said, pulling back to look at me. "Not after everything." We went in together at 9:45. The courtroom was smaller than I had pictured, wood-paneled, a single row of public benches behind the rail, and I saw Kevin already seated at the far table with a lawyer I didn't recognize, a younger man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone under the table like he thought nobody could see him doing it. Rhonda sat one seat over from Kevin, her purse in her lap, her chin up in that particular way of a woman who has decided ahead of time she is not going to look rattled no matter what gets said. Kevin looked over once when we came in, just once. His eyes caught mine for a second, and there wasn't anger in them the way I might have expected, more a kind of tight-cornered blankness, a man watching a number come up on a scoreboard he'd been telling himself wouldn't matter. Judge Holloway came in at 10 sharp, a broad woman with steel-gray hair pulled back plain, and the whole room stood and then sat again when she told us to. She had a stack of folders in front of her already, and she didn't waste any time on formalities beyond the basic ones the law required. This is a hearing on a petition for guardianship filed by Kevin Mullins regarding his stepfather-in-law, Harold Adams, she said, reading it plain off the page in front of her. No drama in her voice at all. Just a woman doing careful work. Mr. Dunn, you represent the respondent. I understand you have materials to present. I do, Your Honor. Craig stood, buttoned his jacket, and set his folder on the table in front of him, opening it with the kind of unhurried care a man uses when he knows exactly what order everything needs to come out in. I'd like to begin with the independent medical evaluation. He walked Dr. Ayala's report into the record himself, since she'd sent a sworn statement rather than appearing in person, and he read the relevant lines out loud, slow and clear. The same words I'd heard her say to me across her desk 2 weeks earlier. Full capacity, sharp memory, sound judgment, no clinical indication of decline whatsoever. He noted, for the record, that this was not a one-time evaluation arranged for the hearing, but the latest in a series going back 2 full years, each one dated, each one on file, each one showing the exact same result. Your Honor, Craig went on, I'd also like to enter into the record a forensic report prepared by Glenda Smith, certified fraud examiner, tracing the finances of Mullins Excavation and Concrete, a company owned and operated by the petitioner. He handed a copy up to the bench and one to Kevin's attorney, whose face I watched go from mild irritation to something considerably more careful as he flipped through the pages. This report documents 3 separate loans taken against equipment already leveraged beyond its value, a pattern of overdue accounts extending back nearly a year, and a buyer already contacted, out of the neighboring county, for the sale of that same equipment, contacted the same week this guardianship petition was filed. The judge looked up from the report at Kevin, just a flick of her eyes, nothing more, but I saw Kevin's lawyer lean over and whisper something urgent, and Kevin didn't look back at him at all, just kept staring straight ahead at the bench like a man watching a wall come down slow, and knowing there wasn't a thing left to brace against it with. And finally, Your Honor, Craig said, I'd like to read into the record a provision of Harold Adams's living trust, restated in 2024, well over a year before this petition was ever filed. He lifted a single page out of his folder, and I recognized it even from across the room, the particular weight of paper Craig's office used for anything that mattered. The trust contains a dual physician requirement for any finding of incapacity, which has not been met, and a forfeiture clause stating that any beneficiary who initiates a contested guardianship proceeding against the grantor, absent a supporting finding from 2 independent licensed physicians, forfeits their beneficial interest under the trust in its entirety, along with any fiduciary role or appointment named therein. I heard Rhonda's purse hit the floor, just the soft thud of it slipping off her lap, and she didn't even reach down for it right away, just sat there with her hand still hovering where it had been. I have here, Craig continued, laying one more document on the table, a statement from Katie Adams Whitmore, the petitioner's sister, detailing the circumstances under which she signed a family support declaration earlier this year, and the discrepancy between what she was told the document said and what it actually authorizes. He didn't read the whole thing out loud. He didn't need to. He simply stated that it was entered, and Judge Holloway nodded and made a note. The judge took a long moment after that, flipping back through pages, and the courtroom stayed so quiet I could hear the radiator ticking somewhere behind the bench. Kevin's attorney stood up once, started to say something about additional time to review the newly submitted materials, but Judge Holloway held up one hand without even looking at him. Counsel, I've reviewed the medical evaluation, the trust language, and the financial report. This petition alleges incapacity that is directly and repeatedly contradicted by 2 years of consistent, independently documented evaluation. It further appears, based on the financial report before me, to be motivated by circumstances entirely unrelated to Mr. Adams's well-being. She set the folder down flat. The petition for guardianship is dismissed. She looked up, over her glasses, at Kevin directly for the first time since the hearing started. Pursuant to the trust provision entered into the record, the forfeiture clause is triggered as of this finding. Any beneficial interest and fiduciary designation held by Kevin Adams and Rhonda Adams under that instrument is terminated, effective immediately. She looked to Craig. Mr. Dunn, I'll expect an order reflecting that, filed with the court by end of week. Yes, Your Honor. And that was it. No gavel banging, no raised voices, just a woman in a black robe closing a folder and calling the next case on her docket, and a whole structure that Kevin had spent the better part of a year building coming down as quiet and total as a wall giving way after the last load-bearing beam finally lets go. I sat there a second, not moving, feeling something in my chest that wasn't triumph exactly. More like the stillness a man feels standing in a field after a storm has finally passed through, checking the fence line and finding, against every fear he'd carried through the worst of it, that the posts had held. I finished the story right where the courthouse floor still felt like it was settling under me. I stood up when Craig touched my elbow, and we walked out past Kevin's table without either of us saying a word to him. He was still sitting there, staring at nothing, and Rhonda had finally bent down for her purse. But she wasn't in any hurry about it either. Outside on the courthouse steps, the cold air hit different than it had going in. Craig shook my hand and told me he'd have the final order in writing by Friday, and then he told me something I hadn't expected to hear from a lawyer. He said some jobs you do for the fee, and some you do because a man deserves to have somebody in his corner who won't let the story get written wrong, and this one had been the second kind. I thanked him and meant it clean through. Katie walked me to my truck. She didn't say much on the way, just stayed close, her hand resting on my arm the way it hadn't in longer than either of us wanted to count. When we got to the truck, she stopped and looked up at me. I want to come out to the house this weekend, she said. Just me, not for anything. I just want to sit at your table again. The table's still there, I told her. Same spot it's always been. I know I've got things to make right. I'm not asking you to skip past that. You didn't build this, Katie. You got used by it. There's a difference, and I've known that difference the whole time, even on the days it didn't feel like enough to hold on to. She hugged me again, longer this time, and I felt something in my chest ease that had been carrying weight since a June afternoon at Cedar Valley Barn. The rest came the way the rest always comes, not in one clean strike, but in the slow settling of a structure that's already lost its footing. Adams Mechanical sent a letter within the month, declining to renew any further subcontracts with Mullins Excavation and Concrete, citing the pending litigation and the company's financial instability. And I heard through Craig that 2 other outfits in the county did the same within weeks of each other, word traveling the way it does among men who work with their hands and talk to each other at supply yards. The equipment buyer out of the next county backed out entirely once the forfeiture order hit public record. No company left worth buying into. By the end of summer, Mullins Excavation and Concrete had folded outright. The trucks repossessed. The yard sold off piece by piece to cover what couldn't be covered any other way. I didn't take any satisfaction in hearing it. I want to say that plain because a man could tell this story wrong and make it sound like revenge tasted sweet going down. It didn't. It tasted like a job finished the way it should have been finished from the start, nothing more. Katie came out that weekend, and most weekends after. Dr. Ayala and I kept our appointment that fall, same as every year, and she wrote the same words she'd been writing for going on 3 years now. Full capacity. Sound judgment. I sat in my kitchen that evening with the paperwork in front of me and poured myself 2 fingers of the good bourbon I keep for the nights that need marking, and I raised the glass toward the window, toward the fence line I had built with my own 2 hands, toward the memory of a woman who'd have known exactly what to say to me if she'd been sitting across that table instead of just in my thinking. A house stands because somebody checked the foundation before the weather came. That's the whole lesson, plain as I know how to say it. If you've got a father or a grandfather still standing strong enough to do that kind of checking for himself, don't wait on him to need saving. Go sit at his table while there's still time to just sit there. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me down in the comments what city you're watching from tonight.